Hi, I'm Gabrielle Schwartz, web editor of Apollo, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Apollo 40 Under 40 Art and Tech event. The 40 Under 40 project was launched back in 2014 as a way of celebrating the most talented and inspirational young people driving forward the art world. The 2021 edition of the project, which we launched last week, is the first to focus not on a geographic region, but on a theme, the intersection of art and technology across the world. Today, we're going to be hearing from three of those individuals featured on the list: the curator, Karen Archey, Egyptologist, Aliaa Ismail, and media art conservator, Fino-Radin, who have all been kind enough to accept our invitation to participate in a conversation hosted by my colleague, Sam Riley. I'm really excited to hear them talk about how new technologies are changing the ways that we preserve cultural artifacts, from Egyptian tombs to computer art, for future generations. But first, I'd just like to take a quick moment to thank the generous sponsors of the Apollo 40 Under 40 Art and Tech, BNP Paribas. As a leading global bank, BNP Paribas has supported art and culture worldwide for more than 3 decades, sponsoring exhibitions at the Royal Academy and recently launching the BNP Paribas Access Art 25 programme, which offered free exhibition tickets to 17 to 25-year-olds in the UK. So thanks very much to them for supporting our project. And now, with no further ado, I will hand over to Sam for the talk.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks very much to everyone for joining us, wherever you're logging in from. I'm Sam Riley, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our 3 speakers for Future-Proofing the Past, an Apollo 40 Under 40 Art and Tech event. We'll be thinking about the ways that new technologies have radically and rapidly changed the ways that art is made, stored, preserved, documented, and displayed. New tech has transformed the tools that museums and heritage organizations have at their disposal, both for conservation and for engaging audiences in new ways. Meanwhile, the ways that artists over the past half-century have adopted time-based media, from video and internet art to performance, has presented new opportunities and new technological challenges for conservators and curators alike. The 3 speakers this evening vary in their expertise from ancient Egypt to contemporary art and from conservation to curating and research. In a moment, I'll be asking each of them to spend a couple of minutes introducing 2 images that they've chosen, which, for them, encapsulate the subject of new technologies, conservation, and display. We'll then move on to a broader discussion before opening up to some questions from the audience in the final 15 minutes or so. I'll be monitoring these throughout, so please do write any questions you have for the speakers in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. But first, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers tonight. Karen Archey joined the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 2017. She oversees the museum's collections of contemporary art and time-based media. She has curated exhibitions with a range of international artists, including Charlotte Prodger and Meta Haven. Currently, she's organizing a large-scale survey of work by the German artist and filmmaker Hito Steyl. Before the move to Amsterdam, Archey was editor of eFlux, where she launched a participatory web publishing platform, Conversations. Fino-Radin is the founder of Small Data Industries in New York, a business that supports clients, including major museums and artists or their estates, in preserving and archiving digital art and cultural heritage. Past clients include the Whitney, Dia, MoMA, Corey Archangel, Sandra Perry, and the estate of Louise Bourgeois. Fino-Radin, who also hosts a popular podcast called Art and Obsolescence, has led workshops on digital conservation in Hong Kong, Basel, Brussels, Mexico City, and New York. The Egyptologist Aliaa Ismail is responsible for producing large-scale 3D scans of the Valley of the Kings using a Lucida 3D scanner. She is currently working on the tomb of Seti I. Part of the work includes training a team of local operators in 3D recording, data processing, and archiving at the Initiative's Training Center, which is also run by Ismail. The replicas are intended to offer public access to fragile heritage spaces that need greater protection and also help researchers better understand, document, and preserve these important heritage sites. Thanks very much to all of you for being here. Aliaa, I wonder if you might start us off with your 2 images.
Hello. Are you going to put on the images or should I? Sorry, I got confused.
I'm just doing it.
Okay, thanks.
Apologies, bear with me a moment. We've got a slight technical hiccup. That should be okay. Aliaa, please go on.
So as you can see here, this is the Hall of Beauties from the tomb of Seti I. And in front of you, there are 4 images. The first one is being a restoration based on the drawings that Belzoni did when he discovered the tomb in 1817. Okay, and then to the right of it, you're going to find another image, and that was taken by Harry Burton in the 19th century. Just below that, we see the other image that has casts that were made on the wall. And so in the time of Belzoni, what actually happened was that he wanted to show everybody what he discovered in Egypt in 1817. And so the only way was to make casts on the wall, which was not a great idea because at the time he didn't have the technology to 3D scan it, which I'm sure if he did, he would have done so. So what Belzoni did was he has done layers of plaster casts, wax casts, and paper casts, paper squeezes on the wall. And basically what happened was when he took off these casts from the wall, he stripped the color with them and therefore left the wall naked of color. And in the last image is what you see in the tomb of Seti I when you go to the Hall of Beauties today. And all this tells us that in the last 200 years of the life of the tomb, so much has happened to it, a lot more than has happened in the last 3,000 years since its discovery. And this gives us the feeling that we need to actually try to track what happens to our heritage. We should not just leave the heritage be, and there's no way to get back to it. And if it wasn't for the watercolors that Belzoni did before he has done the squeezes and drew on the walls, we were not going to be able to track so much that has happened to it until now. And what we aim to do is actually to 3D scan the tomb of Seti I in this initiative in order to make a record of it at its current state now so that you can monitor it and understand what happens to it in the future. Can you please pull up the next image? So what we're doing in the Valley of the Kings, this initiative that is by Factum Foundation is basically to 3D record all the tombs in the Theban necropolis. But we're starting with the most important tomb, and that being the tomb of Seti I. This tomb is important because it has so much of the history and the religion, and we know so much about the damage that happened to it from Belzoni's records. So such an important place, it needs to be recorded for the future generations, because what happens is in the future, what if disasters are happening every day, whether it's man-made disasters or you're getting those natural disasters, whatever is happening, we're losing our heritage and we're losing our history. And if there is a way to try and preserve this information further on, then why not take this initiative and push it further? What we're trying to do is have a very precise record of all the surface data from the tomb of Seti I.
Thank you very much, Aliaa. That's extremely interesting. There's some ideas there sort of about conservation as a historical process, I suppose, rather than a one-off event. That there's no final answer often, so it's crucial to show you're working. I'm sure these are ideas that we'll certainly come back to in the discussion. In the meantime, Ben, I wonder if you could please introduce your images.
Sure. Great. So before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that today I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Seneca Nation. I would like to acknowledge the Seneca community and pay my respects to their past, present, and future elders, and express my solidarity with the land back movement. So, in conservation, our first task, which is the one that most people are likely familiar with, is to, where possible, slow the process of aging to ensure that things aren't falling apart, degrading, or lost unnecessarily. And this means proper environmental conditions, security, storage, and sometimes preventive measures such as the capture of unstable media, whatever is dictated by the materials inherent in the work. Equally, if not more important, though, is the process of gathering information and generating knowledge pertaining to the holistic identity of the work, the artist's intentions, the push and pull and relationship between concept and physicality, inherent qualities and characteristics of given materials present in the work, and their varying degrees of importance. And this is because it's just a simple fact that obsolescence is inevitable. Just as you cannot expect the same performance artist to always be alive to perform their own work, time-based media consists of the performance of an idea, of a concept on the platform of a particular technology. And the day will inevitably come that the technology will cease to exist for any number of reasons. If the artwork cannot ever change in any way, then it will someday simply cease to exist beyond material relics and performance documentation. Slide. So my work and the work of other time-based media conservators does, yes, sometimes involve incredibly detailed, nerdy, technical stuff, but all of that would be nothing without the work that happens in tandem, the relationships that we create with artists and other stakeholders to understand how the work should be cared for in the future. And the generation of this foundation of oral histories, opinions, as well as facts and figures to inform the future care of the work. Change and variability is synonymous with survivability. Time-based media art, including performance art, can never always be the same. It's just simply impossible. So the work of conservation then, and I'm paraphrasing Pip Lawrenson here, is to steward these artworks through these inflection points of inevitable change, ensuring that the artwork emerges intact, not just materially, but in spirit. And I just want to say that the artwork that I've been speaking over here is As Long as It Lasts by Lawrence Weiner, obviously a classic instruction-based conceptual work of art. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Again, that notion of stewardship, I suppose, is it raises very interesting questions about how conservation of more contemporary forms like time-based media might compare and contrast with older kinds of conservation, and also with the changing idea, as you said, of artist intention and how you can communicate this to audience, or how far it's possible or desirable. Again, ideas I'm sure we'll come back to. Karen, could you please introduce your images?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm not going to get too much into like necessarily what I do, but just kind of blast through these images. This is a work called Mouchet.org, and it's a very important work to me. Firstly, because I've known of it for a very long time. It was one of the first internet-based artworks that I'd seen, but it's also in the Stedelijk collection. And if you could just go forward to the next image and maybe go back. So you can see that these two images look quite different. One is a screenshot, and this image here that you see it's taken actually in a gallery that's in the Stedelijk. That's the kind of installation version of the same work. So they look quite different, but they are indeed the same work. And this is possible because the nature of the work is so extremely variable, performative and complex in nature. And so if I were to hazard a definition of what this work is, I would call it an online performance by the artist Martina Nedam. And it has lasted since 1996, so that's now 25 years. This is a kind of almost choose your own adventure website that is made by a fictional 13-year-old girl who also is an Amsterdam-based artist who calls herself Mouchet. I think the question is, how do you acquire this kind of work if it's an online performance that happens over the course of decades? We actually acquired a version of this. So the title is Mouchet.org version 1, and the date is 1996 ongoing. So that means that we have a certain amount of data that represents this piece. And then we'll kind of see in the future if we can also acquire a version 2. So the data that we received ranges from 1996 to, I believe, 2016 when we acquired that work. And so the documentation of this sort of work is quite a challenge, because how do you document something that, you know, a website that's been updated every day for 25 years? So we've recorded hours of interviews with the artist, speaking about things ranging from her intentions to how she keeps up with the website's maintenance, to its technical specifications, to what her wishes would be if she were to pass away. So then the next question might be, how do you show this work? So at the Stedelijk, we have experimented before with just kind of straightforwardly showing internet art on a computer in a gallery, and that kind of fell a little bit flat. So in conversation with the artist, we came up with this presentation that might be more suited to a gallery setting, which is a kind of gigantic screenshots and 2 pixel perfect GIFs on small screens that kind of represent the project. And then it has a QR code that the gallery visitor can use to experience the online version of the work. So yeah, that's kind of basically an intro of what I wanted to talk about, celebrating Mouchet and Martina Nedam.
Thank you very much, Karen. Again, there's questions of what I suppose what an artwork as vast as Mouchet really consists of, and how you can stay true to something with so much documentation in like I suppose the partial environment of the gallery space, which is again certainly something we'll come back to. So let's move on to discussing some of these ideas. Aliaa, I wanted to ask you first of all, just you mentioned Belzoni and his early interventions on the site of the tomb of Seti. And I think a nice way into sort of beginning to draw all of these ideas together is to sort of think about how new technologies have changed the practice of preservation on sites like the one that you work on.
So in the past, and actually until quite recently, I mean, we're talking the last 5 years or so, people were still using those plastic sheets to draw on the walls. And that was kind of strange. I mean, you're thinking, you know, we're in this world where everybody's like using cameras and fancy technology. And then there's still those archaeological missions who were using basically this plastic sheet and this black drawing pen and basically tracing the images. And it was actually until very recently thought to be one of the most accurate ways to document heritage in Egypt. And now actually missions are starting to work in different ways, but as archaeological missions are mainly based on Egyptologists, they are getting into the technologies, but the more commercial ones. What we are doing in our project is basically we're using this scanner that is Lucida, and that one was actually fabricated and made in Factum Foundation. So it was made for the actual need. And what it does is it covers most of the limitations of the commercial systems, although it is slower, a lot slower, but it gives you the data that none of the commercial systems can provide. You're talking about a very high level of accuracy, like 254 pixel per inch. And what happens is when a person is seeing the data online, they are sitting here, they are with the data, they are not like when you're in the site. Have anybody been to an Egyptian tomb? The lights are very dim basically, and when you go in you're like, oh my god, you can't see anything. And if you're studying this, you could stay there for 100 days and not benefit as much as spending one day there in the computer looking at the very details that make the wall that you are studying or the shape. And that's what we're all about. It's precision and getting the details out there.
And Ben, I wanted to ask, do you draw on sort of the same, do you learn from Factum Foundation in the ways that new tech is being used to, completely revolutionize the way that we engage with old heritage sites? Do you learn from that in what Small Data Industries does, or do you sort of define the conservation of time-based media as against the kind of more traditional works that are being conserved?
No, not at all. I mean, and this is actually very top of mind for me because I recently sat down with Glenn Wharton, the conservator and who's the chair of the program at UCLA, the Getty, I forget the whole name of their program. It's a very, very, very long title. But Glenn is an old colleague of mine, and he got his start in anthropological conservation. And so I think that actually the conservation world, broadly speaking, and especially the conservation of contemporary art and time-based media art, owes a lot to that field. Not so much in the more archaeological senses, but the more anthropological senses in terms of social engagement and semi-structured interviews and things like that. Those are all things that Glenn basically brought from that field into the contemporary art and conservation field, especially through being the founder of Voices in Contemporary Art, a nonprofit that's dedicated to training people in conducting good artist interviews. In terms of these more like analytical tools, for analyzing cultural heritage, it's not really something that's factored so directly into time-based media conservation, but I've definitely seen artists doing really cool stuff. Like Morshon Alahari comes to mind, and yeah.
And does that sort of chime with you as well, Karen? I mean, I think a lot of people sort of have this sense of time-based media as meaning this sort of schism in the the 1970s that changed the way that galleries and artists and museums operate. But I wonder if how far you do see your role at the Stedelijk as differing from that of curators in more traditional fields. I mean, in terms of, I wonder, just building on what you're saying about documenting online performances like Mouchet.
That's a great question. I think that also thinking about time-based media and conservation, it is remarkably physical. Like it is remarkably technical as well. You think about new media being quite kind of ephemeral, but it's really not. There are a lot of kind of physical and technical checks that make the longevity of a work possible. Ben would be able to speak about that much more intelligently than I would. But I think also about time-based media documentation and conservation is being kind of part of this philosophy that I think Ben was also talking about, thinking about best practices in terms of how you can preserve an artist's wishes. and, you know, kind of future-proof them, as it were. So yeah, I think that those things are all quite interrelated. In terms of the technology that's used, maybe that differs actually quite a bit. I think also about someone like Kate Lewis, and also even myself. You know, I started as the time-based media curator, and then now I'm the curator of contemporary art because of the work that I do with the collection, because it's so important to document. And this is something that the other contemporary curators at the Stedelijk approached in a very different way. So yeah, I think that maybe more object-based disciplines have something to learn from time-based media colleagues. And as I was just about to say, Kate Lewis, you know, started as the time-based media conservator, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, and is now head of conservation at MoMA. So.
Yeah, my old boss. I'm so glad you actually bring up Kate, because, you know, Kate's career trajectory, I think, is a great example of, I think that something that's not really known outside the conservation field is that the contemporary art conservation field is very new. And it actually developed in parallel with time-based media conservation. It really wasn't until the 90s, and in fact, it was in the Netherlands, that, you know, there were these first conferences where art conservators were like, hey, let's talk about this contemporary art stuff, because it's a little bit different. You know, in reference to Kate, you know, she was part of the first cohort of photograph conservators, which also, again, like, really just developed in the 90s, actually, here in my hometown of Rochester, New York, you know, due to the legacy of Kodak and the Selznick Institute and the George Eastman House. So, you know, I think when we say traditional, it's important to contextualize for people that, you know, unless we're talking about the conservation of like Renaissance paintings or something like that, conservation is a very actually new field. When you think about the especially, you know, here having an Egyptologist on the panel, when you think about the longer tail of history, conservation as we know it is quite new. And even if we're talking about paintings and objects, you know, the ethics that and just the way that the field approaches things today is still pretty fresh.
Sure, I think the novelty of this world is certainly something to come back to. I just wanted to pick up on Karen's point earlier, just in terms of this question of, I suppose, how you preserve an artist's wishes, right? There's, you know, I'm fascinated to hear from Aliaa about how, in, you know, the details of when you come across something that has had so many interventions in the last sort of 150 years, but also is so far removed in time. I mean, how does a sense of trying to preserve or maintain a kind of an original that's now 3,000 years old factor in what you do?
So basically, like, when we're scanning the tomb of Seti, we actually came across a lot of graffiti in the process. And it was very interesting because some of this graffiti, you couldn't really see it with your eyes because the color has faded away. And it has basically become a very subtle impression that you could only see it through the scans. And that was really good because it tells you who has been there and what they have done. And the good thing is that the object is not just a thing that happens and ends. It's living. It's just like us. It grows, it ages, it meets people, it discovers new things. And what we do in our work is to try to understand the complex biographies of these beautiful artifacts, to see what happened to them since they have been rediscovered. Have they been discovered before their European discovery time or were they just not discovered until then? And a lot of these things are popping up as you scan an object. As you look at it more closely, you are seeing more of it and how it has survived through these years.
Absolutely, yeah. And this sort of the ways that objects kind of accumulate meaning over the course of history. I mean, this is sort of your bread and butter, Ben, really, isn't it?
Well, no, it's not. And I get so envious when I hear conservators of like material, physical material, talk about this stuff, because there's just so much more to analyze, with the technology we have today. I mean, I remember back when I was at MoMA, my colleague Michael Duffy was preparing for the big Magritte show that happened a few years ago, and he made a massive discovery of a painting that had been in the Cattle Grisonnet, but just it had been documented as having existed, but nobody knew where it was. And it turns out Magritte had ripped it into quarters and reused the canvas. And he was, able to confirm this in part by looking at essentially, an analysis of the thread pattern on these 4 distinct, totally different paintings in different collections. And with media, there's so much less of that. With analog media, you do get a bit of it because it is inherently a more physical form, and you can, for instance, look at the contents of a videotape, and a skilled technician can show you, okay, this is a 4th generation copy, and I can see that because of X, Y, and Z, and that's evidence of that. But when we're talking about digital files, it's just well, I copied it from one file system to another, and the file system metadata was incompatible. So now it says it was created in 2021. Oops. There's it's not that there's nothing to analyze. There certainly is, but it's just not the kind of rich perspective that you get when you're using really advanced analytical tools to understand the physical world. It's an inherently different paradigm.
Yeah. So, but is it not true that as sort of software changes, modes of presentation change, that works of net art sort of accumulate new meanings over time? I mean, I'm interested in the idea of, I suppose, artist intention in the work that you do, Ben, and how far, we've heard from Aliaa that it's very hard to get back to that because there's so many different additions and accumulations. But would you say that you're therefore more sort of committed to preserving the artist's original idea?
Yeah, I mean, where to start? There's so much to talk about there. I think that the example of Mouchet that Karen shared is a great one, or really any website. I think that's in the broader internet art community for, 3 decades has really been the kind of the discourse, right? It's what does a net artist do when they're inside the white cube? And there's 1,000 different examples of what you can do. And I appreciated the example of what Karen was showing, because I think that it's actually, even though it's a pretty small sample set, it's pretty broad in terms of representing different techniques that different net artists have used over the years, in terms of okay, we're gonna have the old CRT in the corner with the emulator running in the background on the Raspberry Pi, so it kind of gives you some kind of feel of maybe what it looked like. But then there's the fact that yeah, sure, but back in the day you would have been sitting at home, eating a snack while you were looking at this, not standing in front of a plinth in the Stedelijk. But I think that showing things in these more flexible terms is more honest in that sense. So it's well, this is, and actually, I was talking about performance art before. I think that that technique of exhibition is that Karen was showing in a lot of ways is not too different from how Thomas Lax decided to show a lot of the Judson material at MoMA a few years ago, where I think that was really a first of its kind show for MoMA, where they're basically showing dance performance art and finding ways to show something so contemporary that has no physicality, and showing it in terms of more of a collection of ephemera and documentation. So yeah, it's always interpretive.
Yeah, for sure. And Karen, I wonder if we can sort of speak a little bit more about some of these, the ways that you use conceptual documentation to sort of ensure that that as sort of contemporary modes of making become or change over the passage of time, they're able to be presented as far as possible in something close to an original form.
Yeah, I think maybe the crux of that question is then what does original mean? And when the kind of work itself is so variable, and there isn't like one actual true piece. That also would pertain to performance or dance. In the Stedelijk collection, we have a work by Michele Rizzo titled Higher, that extension, and that is a piece that unfolds over the course of about a month. Well, in its first instance, it's a dance piece performed by, I believe, 3 to 15 performers. And then the way in which we have displayed it so far has been first through a registration and then a live event. And then going forward, we've acquired one of the costumes from that piece. And then we're working on, we commissioned an essay from the artist, and have a kind of more high quality registration, also an instruction manual, and a chain of ownership for the stewardship of the work. And which I think is really interesting, that there are people who embody that piece, and they can be kind of teachers that pass the piece down from generation to generation, or dancer to dancer. This is something that I think also Tino Segal does as well. But so, yeah, I mean, for me, the question about originality just comes down to documenting artists' intentions as much as possible, and then having them in conversation as long as possible. I would also say that it's not just time that we're fighting against, it's also staff changes and faulty system upkeep, and lots of museums are decades old, and we have really old computer systems that aren't organized very well, and some colleagues don't know how to use them or find back information. So it's also kind of about keeping up a kind of living memory of these works and presenting them as much as possible, and being very careful about the kind of promise of collecting, and making an actual promise to steward that work.
I love this idea of sort of living memory being passed down, and that the new technological age is sort of still relying on ideas of kind of oral stewardship of ideas in much the way that we always have done. It's just a good segue into sort of thinking again about what Ben was saying about the novelty of this world, about the fact that there are new things. There have been, huge changes. And one question I was really interested to ask Ben is you run small data industries. You've also participated in lots of training programs, across the world. How challenging is it to keep a kind of group of specialists together in something that is changing so rapidly?
Yeah, I think something that's important for people to understand is that in time-based media conservation, there is never any one person that has all the answers or skills or knowledge. And in a lot of ways, the job of a conservator is to be almost like a project manager, somebody who knows the people who have those niche skills, or know somebody who knows somebody, because sometimes the particular skill needed for a project can be very niche. I think to answer your question specifically about the maintenance of that knowledge, that's a really tough one, and I don't really know if I have an answer for you, because it is something that concerns me just in terms of when it comes to analog audiovisual materials, especially, the best of that knowledge is contained in the heads of people of a certain generation, and they're not going to be around forever. And it's something that a lot of people have been worried about for a long time. And there's been various, grant-funded projects that have attempted to gather oral histories or training materials or information, but I'm also not too worried about that, because the fact is digitization of analog audiovisual materials is going to be a finite cultural phenomenon in the world. There's going to come a time who knows, 10, 15, 25, 30 years from now, when we just don't do that anymore because it's impossible, or it's become something that, there's only one lab in the world and it costs $10,000 to digitize one tape. And that's ultimately, at the end of the day, because of the fact that there's only so many pieces of equipment in the world. They don't make them anymore. And, when you go to somebody like George Blood Audiovisual in Philadelphia, he has massive room just full of old broken, video players and audio players that he uses for parts. And when those are gone, they're gone, So, I'm hopeful because, the field of conservation is very much a community. And I think that we all learn from each other, and there are generations, when you look at the field of conservation, there are very distinct generations in a way. And I think that knowledge gets passed down in some like really special, like intimate ways, just by like collaborating and working together and being, for instance, I learned so much when I was at MoMA, and before that, when I was at Rhizome, I was learning so much from some really, really generous people. I'm thinking like Mark Tienzo and like Don Menerick, who were kind of like really pioneering a lot of the ideas of the use of digital forensics and archives. So, it's very much just as the stewardship of contemporary art is so reliant on the kind of like oral history and very like subjective perspectives of artists and stakeholders, the skills for this kind of work, it's just something it's passed down through collaboration, really, and hands-on learning. And that hands-on aspect is really critical. It truly is. This isn't something that you can just like, I don't know, read about and start, it's like, and what experience looks like, it can be very diverse. It's like you can get these skills by working in an artist studio, or maybe working in a museum, or just by being an artist. It's a big tent in the time-based media conservation world.
Sure, and Aliaa, you've also worked with sort of training teams of local operators in 3D recording, and I wonder if this sense of the hands-on, or the essentialness of the hands-on nature of this work chimes with you.
So actually, yes, we are training here operators, and mainly the people we're training are from the local community and the Ministry of Antiquities. We're also training inspectors from the Ministry of Antiquities. And I think this set of skills that we're passing on is very important, because even when we like stop scanning like the Tomb of Seti first, because it's going to be finished at some point, we feel that these tools, and we're going to be also, Factum Foundation is going to be donating these scanners to the local community, to the Ministry of Antiquities. And therefore, we want this project to be just carried forward and on moving, and not just the Tomb of Seti first. We wanted to scan all the tombs on the Theban necropolis. Earlier, you were speaking about how the data, how as technology improves and moves forward, all the older technologies are dying out. So for this particular thing, I'll speak on our project example. And what we're doing is to record all the raw data as well, so that even when there is like better technologies, we can reprocess this raw data to come up with much better 3D renders than the ones we have now. So what is special about this scanning system also that we are using is that it's not like the commercial ones where it gives you an end product, but it rather gives you both raw data and end product. So you are not like stuck and can't move forward. No, rather than that, you have endless possibilities. And as long as you move forward in the future and there are more programs, more advanced programs to reprocess this data, you're going to have better data and better results. And this is how it sort of works.
Sure. So it's sort of it's accumulative. It's as we sort of said at the beginning, it's never fixed. It's constantly improving, and what we can learn and what we know is sharpening. But I do just have at the back of my mind a very interesting point that Ben made about there being, the potential that with the kinds of recording and scanning and documenting that we're all doing in the current age, that there comes this point that there might be too much information. And I wonder if, Karen, that sort of factors into how you work.
Yes. I mean, that's a really interesting question, because I have to ask myself that quite often, actually. How much is too much information, and what is a reasonable amount of information? I remember I had done this workshop at MoMA that was funded by the Mellon Foundation, called Getting Started, which Ben actually spoke at. But I remember that I'm sorry that this conversation is so MoMA-centric, actually, because they are very much leading a lot of things in time-based media, but there are other institutions. But I remember a topic of conversation in this workshop was that MoMA has a kind of collecting promise to steward a work for a certain amount of years. Ben, do you remember this? No. Okay. Well, I remember it being something crazy, like 200 years or something. And that kind of provoked me to think about, what is my goal as a curator? How long do I want to preserve this work for? As we've spoken about, there are only so many CRT monitors in the world. The Stedelijk has a lot, and we also know how to kind of repair them as time goes on. But what will it mean in 50 years when this machinery eventually really does kind of come to die? But so, in terms of all of our interviews, we have this kind of standard list of questions that we ask, and we update it for every interview with every artist for every work that we collect. And these interviews have gone from 45 minutes to like 2 or 3 hours. And then that kind of level of information, even just the data that we're acquiring, so like the audio transcript, made us kind of revisit, okay, what kind of storage do we need on our server? And our IT guy got kind of mad at me because I'm taking up so much room on our server. And I have to say, it is extremely useful information for legal purposes, for exhibition purposes, even just to know how to pronounce someone's name. That's something that we ask standard with every artist interview. Can you please just pronounce your name? And you would be surprised how many times I'm not pronouncing artists' names correctly that I've known for a long time. But it's just kind of stuff like that I think over the years, we've now, I have, in kind of conversation with our time-based media conservator, Flaminia Fortunato, also created another trajectory for documentation, which is just a form, it's just an email, it's not an interview, to try to kind of cut down on some of this massive amounts of information that we're generating.
Fascinating. We're going to move on to questions in a moment, but Ali, I just wanted this question that Karen raised, how the decisions that go into how long a work needs to be preserved for, I guess the kind of editorial decision of what works need to be preserved. But when Bolzoni found the tomb of Seti in the 19th century, it was remarkably well preserved for a tomb of its kind, right? Is the kind of effort and expertise that's being expended on this site, would that proliferate across the world, or is it very sort of particularly chosen which sites you record in that way?
Well, the tomb of Seti I, it was very unique for one reason, because the whole story about it and how Bolzoni went about it, the whole idea was to make a copy that he wanted to exhibit in London, in the Piccadilly, in the Egyptian Hall in 1821. And so basically he did those costs, and then he went and made a facsimile. And actually what we are intending to do is make a facsimile of the tomb of Seti I. So we are using these scans, and we have already done part of the facsimile, which was the Hall of Beauties and the pillared hall from the burial chamber. And that was exhibited in the Antiken Museum in Basel. It was a 5 months long exhibition, and it was perfect. Actually, everybody who went in there could not tell the difference between being in the real tomb and being in the facsimile. And it was this kind of thing where each of the objects started having its own authenticity in a way. So you were talking like this one is kind of a facsimile recorded in 2016, and the other is basically an ever-evolving tomb. So you just have this one stop, and there people are visiting it. It's going to be like, if we maybe move 10 years forward and go back to the facsimile is going to look the same as it was. And if it has any like because it's made out of the materials used were very non-affected much there. We're using this basically, okay, it was done by aluminum, and it was carved basically through 3D millers, CNC millers. And basically it has this color layer that is added to it as a color, a skin that is basically added to it. And what happens is how this material evolves is very different from how the tomb in the Valley of the Kings is going to evolve. And so seeing the difference between these two objects, you've already created this like parallel, and people are viewing it in a good way.
Yeah, sorry.
Was that a question? Sorry, I got on.
For sure, there's I suppose there's various different ways of engaging and caring for all the different kinds of artworks that really we've been speaking about. But let's move to some questions for the audience for the last 10 minutes or so. One for Ben: what's the most challenging technology you've encountered to preserve or conserve?
That's a great question. Most challenging technology. iOS, but maybe that doesn't even count because it's kind of hopeless. Yeah, I mean, basically, oddly enough, the more contemporary the technologies, the harder they are to preserve in a way, because lock-in and proprietary systems has just become more the norm. And things are just harder to work with, versus like, I could certainly point to maybe a piece from the 90s with robotics and custom software, but the fact is all of that at the end of the day is like pretty analog, and like you can use like a logic analyzers to like reverse engineer things. But when it comes to an iPhone app, if you don't have the source code, and if you're not actively maintaining it the way a software developer would to just stay up to date with the latest iOS, then it's just gone. And I would say if people are interested in this, Flaminia, who Karen mentioned, wrote a great case study on the preservation of iOS apps, which I believe is available through the EMG journal, American Institute for Conservation. And also I did some research with the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and my colleagues there and I published that work also through the electronic media review from the American Institute for Conservation. But yeah, iOS is very, very challenging because you just have to keep it maintained.
Yeah. We've got a question for Aliaa from Morag Cross. Are Belzoni's interventions like casts, paper squeezes, are they also regarded as artworks in their own right, and do you work to conserve them?
Actually, it would be really, really nice if we can get the casts that were made, and I'm sure there's somewhere in London. So if we could find them, I think it would be great to actually scan them and see what layers of colors that still remain within the casts, because the casts exist and he has done molds from them, and the molds will have all the color layer basically that was stripped up from the wall.
One for Karen on Mouchet. Did it require any conservation? i.e., were things broken when you got it?
No, the Mouchet was actually very lovingly put together as an acquisition by Martina Nedam, the artist herself, as well as Annette Decker, who is a art historian or kind of media historian at the University of Amsterdam, and she's been quite involved in kind of shaping the field. So Annette had a very big hand at conceptualizing what exactly would be part of the acquisition. And as such, we got basically a data dump of many, many folders of updates and images. And I think the conservation happens in activating the work. So figuring out what it actually means to put it on the wall or on a computer and show it. But yeah, that was, it was more in terms of documentation that we had a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Karen. One more for Aliaa from Kin Nguyen. Would the Lucida scanner that's used for scanning Egyptian murals work, for example, for Burmese Buddhism cave paintings? Are your scanners are they limited to certain surfaces, or can they be adapted?
Basically, our scanners is the Lucida system, because in fact we have different systems for different things. But the Lucida is made for mostly flat objects with relief. So if it's a cave, if it's flat and has relief, it can work. If it is a painting, because we have done also the Raphael paintings from the V&A, and we've done all of them, the Raphael cartoons. We've done many other paintings from the Renaissance period, and basically all you need is that the relief, the depth of relief that it records is 2.5 centimeters. And if there are areas of higher relief, then we just do multiple recordings and get all the data and combine it together.
Sure, and then a final question for Aliaa, just about got time. So sometimes the Tomb of Seti might be an example. The interests of conservation, so preventing further deterioration of an artwork, come into conflict with those of restoration, so putting it back to the best condition it's known to have been recently. When this happens, which principle should win?
That is quite a complicated question indeed. But what I feel is that our work is mainly to preserve what exists now, because once we do that, we have an actual record moving forward. And once you have a record, you can then think how to do with it. And the idea also that if you have a record that can be reproduced, so for instance, if a scholar is working on a specific wall or specific area, they can reproduce it, they can 3D print it, and they can do whatever they want with it. Basically, they can display their ideas in a totally different way that was not on the table before.
Sure, I think that certainly answers the question for me. Well, I think that's about all we've got time for. We've ranged across history here. We talked about too much information. I hope we haven't provided too much information, but seriously, many thanks to our speakers for what I thought was a really interesting and engaging discussion. So thanks to Karen Archey, Ben Fino-Radin, and Aliaa Ismail. And thanks very much to all of you for joining us.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much, Sam. Or should I Egyptian style?
Cheers. Good night.
Cheers.